After first regretting her racist comments, a lady on an aircraft apologizes to a black soldier. Passengers, families, professionals, and students were all crammed into the waiting area at Chicago O'Hare International Airport. Roaming announcements urge passengers to double-check any last-minute changes to their schedules, keep an eye on their personal items, and check their gates. The aircraft to Atlanta was originally supposed to take off at 9 a.m., but the lady made an error. A business executive in her 30s, Julia Prescott, was on her way to a much-anticipated management conference. As she perused her inbox on her phone, she was getting ready to woo her way into a prominent promotion. Julia let out a sigh of relief as the crackling voice above her announced that first-class passengers may board, signaling that she would soon be able to leave the mayhem. As she hurried down the jet bridge, she could feel the warm embrace of the first-class cabin, complete with plush chairs and glasses of champagne. Pretending to examine her phone's screen for messages marked as urgent, Julia took seat 2A. A tall, broad-shouldered black man in a clean army uniform scanned the row numbers at the front of the cabin a few seconds later. He had a name patch that read, D. Parker. With a controlled air of courtesy, Parker nodded to Julia and then gestured to the seat next to her, 2B. With a forced grin, Julia greeted him, her irritated green eyes darting from side to side. It was hinted at by Julia's bias that he likely wasn't even paying full price. She unbuckled her seatbelt in a fit of annoyance. Flight attendants floated along the aisle, delivering pre-departure refreshments as Daniel Parker settled into his seat. He politely nodded toward Julia, but she looked sharply toward the window. When one of the attendants saw Daniel's uniform, she stopped and thanked the sergeant profusely for his service. Everyone was falling over themselves to express their gratitude for the military, but Julia couldn't help but feel resentful at the additional benefits they received. As Julia grabbed for her phone, she appeared to be busy, and her lips formed a thin line. After the first-class passengers had settled in, the aircraft taxied away from the gate, and the cabin doors were closed. Julia peered over the edge of her seat to see Daniel stealthily remove a little image from the inner pocket of his jacket. Peeking over the corner of her eye, she caught sight of a photograph of a cheerful youngster, about 8 or 9 years old, adorned with a glittery headband and clutching a soccer ball. Despite being very pleased with her accomplishments, Julia found herself annoyed and almost rolled her eyes at the mom. Julia almost scoffed at the ma'am before sarcastically remarking that her dad must be so proud to be a soldier. Visiting her daughter Kayla in Atlanta was really her reason for returning home from duty, or whatever it was. All Daniel said was, "I paid for this seat myself." Even though Julia was already anxious and raw, she felt the need to make fun of how great it would be to get the airplane upgrade. In an effort to calm the simmering resentment building up within her, Julia asked for a glass of Chardonnay as the cabin lights went down. As she looked over, she saw that an attendant had given Daniel a tray of wine, but he had graciously rejected. It wasn't about the food, but the principle. Julia shrugged, despite the fact that she could feel a subtle ache. As Julia felt her uneasiness deepen, she looked at the picture once again, this time catching a fleeting glimpse of Kayla's cheerful grin. Feeling glad to be far from her soldier, Daniel, Julia lands at Hartsfield-Jackson Atlanta International Airport. She overhears Daniel, who is frantic to see her and get her to the hospital, talking on the phone. Though she is afraid to approach Daniel, Julia is hell-bent on giving a stellar presentation at the conference. She gets a text message from a coworker at baggage claim, requesting that she provide her revised slides before the day's end. The reminder that Daniel is not her responsibility interrupts Julia's efforts to tune out the airport's mayhem and crowds. It begins to rain as they make their way to the Harborwood Hotel, and they are soon sucked into the notoriously bad traffic in Atlanta. Not only is Julia having trouble concentrating on her pitch deck, but she is also struggling to focus on the discussion with Daniel over his daughter's health problem. Even though troops often return home with reports of sexual assault and battery, she is determined not to let this mess with her sense of system. The next morning, Julia will be in a downtown tower for the start of her conference. The rush of business achievement is her fuel. Many of Julia's coworkers gave her encouraging nods once she finished speaking. But then, her Atlanta News app alerts her to the fact that the child of an Atlanta Army sergeant is battling for her life. A picture of Kayla Parker, who has a congenital heart condition that might kill her, is included in the story. As Julia looks on in disbelief, she discovers Kayla in a pediatric intensive care unit, plugged with several tubes. In light of Kayla's deteriorating health, Daniel Parker has reportedly gone back to the United States on emergency leave, as mentioned in the story. To cover the shortfall, he launched an online campaign, but Julia is experiencing her first wave of guilt in a long time. During the conference's cocktail hour, people talk business and share tales of their professional journeys. Even though Julia feels awkward attempting to discuss profit margins or Q4 estimates with the small group of executives, she keeps her characteristic grin on for the sake of the discussion. As she daydreams about the news report, Julia feels a wave of remorse wash over her. In conclusion, Julia's time at Hartsfield-Jackson Atlanta International Airport is a whirlwind of feelings and experiences as she struggles with the demands of her profession and her bond with her soldier, Daniel. The story of Kayla Parker's specialist heart surgery had a profound impact on Julia Prescott. Her friend's rehabilitation has been her driving force, and she feels obliged to give, despite her inability to pay her income and investments. Through her research, she comes across a link to Daniel Parker's fundraising website. This campaign aims to raise $150,000 to support Kayla's recuperation. When Julia reads the comments on the fundraiser and sees that insurance isn't paying for all of Kayla's operation, her heart starts to clench. Despite her reservations, Julia makes the decision to give. The contribution is only a bandage covering a deeper wound, she knows. She owes them more than just money. Julia gets up the next morning, writes a letter to her conference team, and then leaves them to go to their own business for a little. The vast Peachtree Children's Hospital campus is adorned with vibrant navigational signs and paintings of cartoon animals as she drives there. Julia is apprehensive for no apparent reason as she makes her way to the third level of the Pediatric Cardiac Intensive Care Unit. Heading up to the third-floor Pediatric Cardiac Intensive Care Unit, she feels an overwhelming sense of unease. Daniel Parker is hunched over Kayla, who is hooked up to a plethora of IVs and monitors when she arrives. Daniel musters up the bravery to straighten his stiff back. Daniel looks up in shock as Julia gently taps on the doorframe. Doctors think that specialist surgery is their only chance for Kayla, who is in serious condition. As Julia nears the bedside, she can feel tears welling up in her eyes. As she mutters, "I'm sorry," she can feel the tears welling up in her eyes. Kayla flutters her eyes open, attempting to concentrate on Julia's countenance as she stirs. She remains perplexed as to what caused Daniel to reconsider, even as he crouches down and whispers to her. After seeing the news broadcast about her and Kayla, Julia feels a surge of guilt. She realizes that her actions were harmful and motivated by ignorance. Black soldier Daniel knows firsthand how hurtful it was to see someone treat him poorly, as if he hadn't worked hard for his position, and how severe Julia's actions were. Julia contributed to Kayla's fundraising, but her throat tightened as she realized she couldn't beg for forgiveness immediately. The news of Kayla's specialist heart surgery and Daniel Parker's goodwill profoundly impact Julia Prescott. She finds it difficult to put into words how she feels about the situation and the individuals she encounters. A lady named Julia resolved to make restitution to Kayla for the harm she had caused her years before. She passed the time in the hospital by coloring pages and reminiscing about her youth. She came to terms with the fact that money couldn't buy happiness, but that she could stand up for herself every day as her confidence developed. After Julia contributed to Kayla's cause, she became aware that Daniel required assistance with insurance, hospital paperwork, and arranging for possible second opinions, which prompted her to get involved in the campaign. Julia offered to help out, even though Daniel was hesitant at first. She learned that a specialist surgeon with expertise in rare congenital abnormalities was Kayla's best bet. That said, the surgeon's waitlist was very lengthy. After leaving the hospital one day, Julia contacted someone in charge of obtaining special medical permissions. Not as an act of penance, but out of genuine concern, she felt an overwhelming need to assist Kayla. On the day of the procedure, they and Daniel's extended family waited in a designated family area. There was an obvious amount of tension, and Julia hoped for anything that might give Kayla a fighting chance. A cautiously hopeful prognosis was issued after the operation, which proceeded smoothly. As Julia delicately caressed Daniel's arm and they embraced, she felt a mix of comfort and wonder. Physical therapy and pain management follow-up scans occupied Kayla's days after her recovery. Julia made frequent visits, often bringing nutritious food or new pajamas. While Daniel retrieved coffee or checked in with the medical personnel, she would sit by Kayla's bedside and read bedtime tales. The comment that Julia was the most amazing adult friend ever, made by Kayla, who was reviving her vitality, touched Julia's heart more than any corporate accolade ever could. Concerned about the gaps in healthcare for military families, news outlets across the country kept following Kayla's story. Julia and Daniel stood side by side in a brief video interview in which Julia described the flood of donations and the steps taken to get Kayla top-notch medical treatment. While onlookers may have thought there was a romance subplot, the reality was more straightforward and significant. Their connection had grown stronger than the traumatic beginning of their relationship on that trip, and they had learned to care for and respect one another. At Kayla's hospital, Julia sought therapy to help her unravel her preconceptions and begin the process of change. Unbeknownst to her, her bias had influenced her perspective on life, including her responses to Daniel Parker on the aircraft. To be sure she would never do that to another individual again, Julia accepted the uncomfortable reality that she had to learn and unlearn. After a long period of stabilization, Kayla reached a major milestone when a pediatric cardiologist cleared her for partial release. Before the last medical treatments, Daniel assisted Kayla into a wheelchair and then turned to Julia, telling her he couldn't repay her for everything she had done. Julia gave him a nervous grin and continued to bring herself into Kayla's life despite her fears. As Kayla adapted to her new medication schedule and reclaimed bits of her youth, the next month seemed like emerging from a dark tunnel. Julia found more satisfaction in the real impact she was having on Kayla's life than in the professional world, which had previously defined her identity. She persisted in her work, but with a newfound perspective, she advocated for corporate philanthropy, claiming that the company's funds might help children with unique medical requirements. Julia was given the opportunity to lead a new corporate social responsibility program after impressing her superiors with her passion for managing it. On a brisk fall night, around 3 months after Kayla's operation, Julia received an invitation to a modest BBQ hosted by Daniel's aunt on the outskirts of Atlanta. While she sat at the picnic table, she observed Daniel demonstrating to Kayla how to throw a flimsy foam football. Remembering how it all began with her cruel words on the aircraft, Julia closed her eyes for a moment and inhaled the aroma of charcoal smoke and freshly cut grass. Later, Julia curled up next to Kayla and read a collection of fairy tales that she had discovered at a nearby bookshop. As the sky darkened and fireflies buzzed around them, Julia read aloud. Kayla leaned her head on Julia's arm and listened intently. Keeping his arms crossed, Daniel stood close by, glancing over every so often to check on Kayla. Over the next several years, Kayla maintained her gradual but steady recovery, with better outcomes at each medical visit. Julia volunteered with several groups that helped military families and children in need of specialized care. She also built a business career that aligned with her charitable efforts. Julia became deeply committed to eliminating the barriers that prevented individuals like Daniel Parker from receiving assistance. She became an outspoken critic of institutional injustices, vowing to do more than just confront her own prejudices. Through gratitude and the decision to be there for one another during life's worst moments, Daniel and Julia formed an unusual family. What began with a seat assignment on an overbooked airplane, once tainted by bigotry and disdain, evolved into a remarkable story of redemption, empathy, and shared humanity.